They said I was losing my mind, locked me in a care home, stole my accounts, and left me with nothing. But they forgot I built that fortune, and I still had the password. With one transfer, every penny was mine again. And while they beg and cry on camera, I sit far away, debt-free, sipping my tea. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, brilliance, and the sweetest revenge you've ever heard, please subscribe to Justice Tales and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one with everyone you know. My name is Walter Harrison, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew everything about family loyalty. I was wrong, dead wrong. But unlike most people who learn that lesson the hard way, I was in a position to do something about it. I built my first software company in 1987, back when personal computers were just starting to become mainstream, and most people thought the internet was a fad that would never catch on. Harrison Tech Solutions started in my garage with $3,000 borrowed against my truck, and a vision of making technology accessible to small businesses. By 1992, we were the leading provider of accounting software for restaurants and retail stores throughout the Pacific Northwest. By 1998, we'd expanded nationally and were processing over $50 million in transactions annually for thousands of small business clients. I sold Harrison Tech Solutions in 2001 for $47 million, just before the .com crash wiped out half the technology companies in Silicon Valley. Good timing, smart planning, and 40 years of experience in recognizing when markets were about to shift. But I'd never been good at sitting still. Instead, I used the money to start Harrison Digital Finance, focusing on early online banking solutions and digital payment processing. By 2008, we were handling secure transactions for major retailers and had developed some of the first mobile payment applications. I sold Harrison Digital Finance in 2012 for $89 million to a consortium of European banks who wanted to expand into the American market. Between the two company sales, plus real estate investments, and a diversified stock portfolio, I was worth approximately $180 million by my 70th birthday. Not bad for a kid who'd grown up in a trailer park in Oregon and never finished college. My wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier from cancer, leaving me alone in our house overlooking the Columbia River with more money than I could spend in several lifetimes and no one to share it with, except my 2 children. Robert was my oldest, 45 years old, married to a woman named Janet who'd never worked a day in her adult life. They had 2 teenage children, lived in a house I'd bought for them, and Robert worked as a consultant for various tech companies, a job I'd arranged through my business connections. Lisa was 3 years younger, married to a man named David who ran a struggling construction business that I'd bailed out multiple times over the years. They had 1 child, a daughter named Emma, and lived in a house I'd also purchased when David's business debts threatened bankruptcy. Both of my children had grown up with advantages I'd never had: private schools, college educations, family vacations to Europe, trust funds that ensured they'd never worry about basic financial security. But somewhere along the way, I'd apparently raised 2 people who viewed my wealth as their birthright rather than my achievement. The first warning sign came in early 2019, when Robert started asking increasingly specific questions about my estate planning during our monthly family dinners. Dad, have you updated your will recently? With tax laws changing and everything, you want to make sure your assets are structured properly. My assets are structured fine, Robert. James Henderson has been handling my legal affairs for 20 years. But what about liquidity issues when the time comes? Some of your investments might be hard to access quickly if there's an emergency. Emergency? Like the emergency of me dying and leaving them to figure out how to access money they'd been counting on. What kind of emergency are you worried about? Robert exchanged a look with Janet that I wasn't supposed to notice. Well, if you got sick and couldn't manage your finances anymore, or if you needed long-term care, we'd need to know how to handle your accounts so we could make sure you got proper treatment. Long-term care, the euphemism for expensive nursing homes where families warehoused elderly relatives they didn't want to deal with anymore. Similar conversations started happening with Lisa around the same time. Casual questions about my daily routine, my memory, my ability to handle complex financial decisions. Dad, yesterday when I called, you seemed confused about what day it was, she said during one of our weekly phone conversations. I wasn't confused about what day it was, Lisa. I was working on a complex investment analysis and was distracted when you called. But you asked me twice why I was calling. Because you were talking about Emma's school schedule. I was trying to understand if you needed me to pick her up or help with something specific. Maybe, but you've seemed a little scattered lately. More forgetful. Forgetful. Because I'd been focused on managing a $180 million portfolio and didn't immediately remember every detail of conversations about teenage drama and social plans. By fall 2019, both Robert and Lisa were making regular comments about my supposed memory problems, my difficulty managing complex tasks, and their concerns about my ability to live independently. None of it was true, but they were building a narrative that would justify taking control of my finances if they could convince the right medical professionals that I was becoming incompetent. The breakthrough moment came in November, when I was reviewing my monthly bank statements and noticed some irregularities in one of my smaller accounts. Small withdrawals, $500 here, $800 there. Amounts that wouldn't trigger fraud alerts but added up to several $1,000s over the past 6 months. The withdrawals were being made through an ATM card I'd never authorized, using a PIN I'd never created. But when I called the bank to report the fraudulent activity, I discovered that the card had been issued to Robert Harrison as an authorized user on my account, with documentation showing that I'd requested the access due to my increasing difficulty managing routine financial tasks. I'd never signed any such documentation, never authorized Robert's access to my accounts, and never had any difficulty managing financial tasks of any complexity. Someone had forged my signature and created false medical records showing that I was becoming mentally impaired and needed family assistance with banking. That evening, I called Robert and asked him to explain the unauthorized access to my bank account. Dad, you asked me to help you with some of the smaller accounts because you were having trouble remembering PIN numbers and getting confused at ATMs. Robert, I've never had trouble with PIN numbers, and I've never asked for your help with banking. Well, maybe you don't remember asking, but you definitely did. Lisa was there when we talked about it. Maybe you don't remember. The perfect response to any elderly person who questions suspicious financial activity just suggests that their memory is failing and their concerns aren't valid. That night, I spent 6 hours reviewing every bank statement, credit card bill, and investment account summary I could access online. What I found was a pattern of small-scale theft that had been going on for over a year, carefully managed to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection while systematically draining money from accounts Robert and Lisa thought I wouldn't notice. They'd stolen approximately $47,000 from various accounts, using forged authorizations and fake medical documentation to justify their access. But more disturbing than the theft was the sophistication of their planning. They'd created a comprehensive false narrative about my mental decline, complete with forged medical records, fake witness statements, and legal documentation. They weren't just stealing my money. They were preparing to steal my legal rights, my independence, and my ability to make decisions about my own life. The next morning, I called my attorney and scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss what I'd discovered and what legal options were available to protect myself. James Henderson had been handling my legal affairs since 1999, and he'd seen every kind of family dispute, business conflict, and financial fraud imaginable. But when I showed him the evidence of Robert and Lisa's activities, his expression went from professional concern to genuine shock. Walter, this isn't just theft. This is a comprehensive conspiracy to commit elder abuse. They've been planning this for over a year, and they're preparing to have you declared incompetent so they can take complete control of your assets. What are my options? Legally, you could have them arrested for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, and the penalties are severe. What about protecting myself in the immediate term? We need to move fast. If they realize you've discovered their activities, they might accelerate their timeline and try to have you committed before you can take legal action. Committed, like being involuntarily placed in a mental health facility or nursing home where I wouldn't be able to manage my own affairs or challenge their control of my assets. How quickly could they do that? With the false medical documentation they've already created, probably within a few days. All they need is a single doctor willing to sign off on their claims about your mental state. Over the next 3 days, James and I created a comprehensive legal strategy designed to protect my assets and my rights while setting up Robert and Lisa for consequences that would ensure they never tried anything like this again. First, we established irrevocable trusts that would protect the majority of my assets from any court order or guardianship proceeding. Second, we created detailed medical and financial powers of attorney that specifically excluded Robert and Lisa from any decision-making authority. Third, we prepared criminal complaints and civil lawsuits that could be filed immediately if they escalated their activities. But most importantly, we set up what James called dead man switches, automated legal processes that would trigger if I disappeared or became unavailable to manage my own affairs. If I missed 2 consecutive weekly check-ins with James's office, criminal complaints would be filed automatically. My assets would be frozen pending investigation. And every major media outlet in the Pacific Northwest would receive detailed information about Robert and Lisa's conspiracy. It was exactly the kind of systematic, comprehensive planning that had made me successful in business, applied to protecting myself from my own children. By the end of that week, I was as legally protected as possible from Robert and Lisa's scheme. But I wasn't satisfied with just defensive measures. They'd spent over a year planning to destroy my independence and steal my life's work. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to have their own lives systematically dismantled by someone who was better at strategic planning than they were. The opportunity came sooner than expected, on a cold December morning when Robert called to tell me he'd scheduled a routine medical appointment for me with a doctor I'd never heard of. Dad, I've been really worried about some of the things you've been saying and doing lately. Yesterday when we talked, you seemed confused about what month it is, and Lisa mentioned that you've been having trouble managing your daily routine. What kind of medical appointment? Just a general wellness check with Dr. Martinez. He specializes in geriatric care, and I thought it would be good for you to establish a relationship with someone who understands the unique health challenges people your age face. People your age? As if 73 was ancient, instead of the age when many successful people were still running companies and making complex decisions. I have a doctor, Robert. Dr. Stevens has been my physician for 15 years. I know, but Dr. Stevens is a general practitioner. Dr. Martinez has specific training in age-related cognitive issues and memory problems. Memory problems I didn't have. Cognitive issues that existed only in the false narrative Robert and Lisa had been building for over a year. What if I don't want to see this Dr. Martinez? Robert's tone shifted slightly, becoming more firm and less conversational. Dad, Lisa and I have been discussing this, and we think it's important for your health and safety that you get a proper evaluation. If you're not willing to do it voluntarily, we might need to involve other people who can help us make sure you're getting appropriate care. Other people, like Adult Protective Services, or court-appointed guardians, or medical professionals who could declare me incompetent based on the false documentation Robert and Lisa had already prepared. When is this appointment? Tomorrow morning at 10. I'll pick you up at 9:30. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was clearly designed to create medical records that would support a predetermined conclusion about my mental state. He asked questions about events that had never happened, confused states I'd never experienced, and problems I'd never had. When I answered clearly and correctly, he reframed my responses as evidence of defensiveness or lack of insight into my condition. At the end of the appointment, Dr. Martinez sat back with practiced concern. Mr. Harrison, based on what I've observed today and the information your son has provided about your recent behavior, I believe you're experiencing early-stage cognitive decline that could affect your ability to make safe decisions. What does that mean? It means I'm going to recommend that you consider assisted living arrangements where you'd have professional support with daily tasks and financial management. Your son and daughter are prepared to help you find an appropriate facility. Robert leaned forward with sad resignation. Dad, Dr. Martinez thinks Sunset Manor would be perfect for you. They specialize in residents who need help with memory issues. Sunset Manor. They'd already chosen the place where they planned to warehouse me while they liquidated my assets. What if I don't want to go to Sunset Manor? Dr. Martinez and Robert exchanged a meaningful look. Mr. Harrison, given your condition, you may not be capable of making rational decisions about your own care. Your family has legal options for ensuring you receive appropriate treatment even if you initially resist. The next morning, Marcus and Lisa arrived at my house with paperwork, suitcases, and expressions of sad resignation about the necessity of taking this step for my own protection. The drive to Willowbrook took 30 minutes, during which they kept up reassurance about how this was temporary, how they'd visit regularly, how they'd make sure I had everything I needed. Willowbrook looked exactly like what it was, an expensive warehouse for elderly people whose families didn't want to deal with them anymore. The intake process took 2 hours and involved signing documents that transferred most of my legal rights to Marcus and Lisa. My room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot where I could see Marcus and Lisa loading my remaining belongings into their car. They'd given me 2 suitcases of clothes and personal items, but everything else I owned was now theirs to dispose of as they saw fit. Your family will be able to visit during regular hours, the coordinator explained, and you'll have access to our common areas, recreational activities, and computer lab during designated times. Computer lab, those were the most important words she'd said during the entire orientation. That evening, I realized that I was probably hours away from losing my freedom permanently unless I acted immediately to protect myself. But as I sat there, surrounded by financial documents, I realized something that gave me hope. They could take away my legal rights. They could lock me in a care facility. They could steal the money in my checking and savings accounts. But there was one thing they didn't know about, one asset they couldn't access even with power of attorney and legal guardianship. The cryptocurrency wallet I'd set up 3 years ago. Back in 2019, when Bitcoin was climbing towards $60,000, I decided to diversify my investments by converting $2.8 million into various cryptocurrencies. The wallet was protected by a 24-word seed phrase that existed only in my memory. No bank could freeze it. No court could seize it. No power of attorney could access it. More importantly, cryptocurrency could be converted to cash and transferred anywhere in the world without going through traditional banking systems that required legal identification and government oversight. If I could get access to a computer and internet connection, I could liquidate my crypto holdings and transfer the money to accounts in countries that didn't honor US legal judgments about mental competency. All I needed was the opportunity. My first week at Sunset Manor was like living in a well-appointed prison designed by people who'd studied every method of making elderly people compliant and manageable. The daily routine was structured around meals, medication distribution, supervised activities, and rest periods. Wake up at a.m. breakfast at 7, morning medications at 8, group activity from 9 to 10:30, free time until lunch, but only in designated common areas under staff observation. It was exactly the kind of institutional schedule designed to prevent residents from having unsupervised time to think, plan, or communicate with the outside world. But what the staff didn't understand was that they were trying to control a man who'd spent 40 years managing complex business operations, coordinating international transactions, and solving problems that required strategic thinking under pressure. The recreation center computers were supervised by volunteers rather than full-time staff, and those volunteers were focused primarily on helping confused residents send emails to their grandchildren rather than monitoring complex online activities. More importantly, the computers had access to public Wi-Fi networks that weren't controlled by Sunset Manor security systems. During my second week at the facility, I began using my allotted computer time to access my offshore bank accounts and monitor Robert and Lisa's attempts to liquidate my assets. Over the next hour, I systematically moved every dollar from accounts Robert and Lisa could potentially access to new accounts they'd never heard of, registered under business names they didn't know existed. $47 million from the primary business account, $23 million from various investment portfolios, $8 million from real estate holdings that could be quickly liquidated, $12 million from retirement accounts that could be accessed with early withdrawal penalties. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I transferred $90 million, half my total net worth, to accounts that were completely invisible to anyone who didn't have the specific access codes and routing information. The remaining $90 million was in assets that would take weeks or months for Robert and Lisa to access even with legal authority. But moving the money was just the first phase of my plan. The second phase involved creating a new identity that would allow me to access those funds and live independently anywhere in the world. I'd been researching identity creation services since discovering Robert and Lisa's conspiracy, and I'd identified a company that specialized in helping people establish new identities for legal purposes, people fleeing domestic violence, entering witness protection, or dealing with complex situations where traditional legal remedies weren't sufficient. For $150,000, they could provide complete documentation for a new identity: birth certificate, social security number, driver's license, passport, banking relationships, and credit history. The process would take 4 to 6 weeks to complete. during which I'd need to stay hidden while Robert and Lisa thought they'd successfully committed me to Sunset Manor. During my 4th week at the facility, I made contact with the identity specialist I'd hired to create my new documentation. The phone call had to be made during supervised phone time, but I disguised it as a conversation with a financial advisor about retirement planning. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Walter Harrison. I wanted to check on the status of the retirement account restructuring we discussed. Mr. Harrison, good to hear from you. Your new portfolio is ready for activation. All the documentation has been completed and the accounts are fully operational. Portfolio, documentation, code words for the new identity and banking relationships that would allow me to access my money and disappear permanently. When can we complete the transfer? Whenever you're ready to make the move, the transition can be executed immediately upon your arrival at our offices. That evening, I finalized my escape plan. The next morning was Saturday, which meant reduced staffing and less supervision of residents' activities. During the regular medication distribution at I would palm the pills instead of swallowing them, then return to my room and induce vomiting to create the appearance of a medical emergency. When staff responded to my call for help, I'd be taken to the medical wing for evaluation, creating confusion and distraction that would give me the opportunity I needed. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold, perfect weather for what I was planning to do. At sharp, I joined the line of residents shuffling toward the nurse's station for morning medications. Good morning, Mr. Harrison, said the duty nurse. How are you feeling today? A little nauseous, I said, which would be true very soon, but otherwise fine. I took the cup, raised it to my mouth, and appeared to swallow the pills while actually holding them under my tongue. 10 minutes later, I was in my bathroom, forcing myself to vomit violently while calling for help in a voice that carried panic and confusion. Help, something's wrong. I can't stop throwing up. The response was immediate. 2 nurses rushed to my room, found me collapsed on my bathroom floor in apparent medical distress, and immediately called for the facility's medical team. Within 20 minutes, I was being wheeled through the medical wing toward the garage entrance, ostensibly for emergency transport to the hospital. But the van waiting in the parking garage wasn't an ambulance. It was Rodriguez and his team, with documentation showing that Walter Harrison was being transferred to a specialized medical facility for treatment of complications related to his existing conditions. Mr. Harrison, Rodriguez said as I was helped into the van, we're going to take excellent care of you. As we drove away from Sunset Manor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete freedom. For the first time since Robert and Lisa had initiated their conspiracy against me, I was in control of my own life again. Where are we going? I asked Rodriguez. Safe house in Vancouver, just across the Canadian border. Your new documentation will be ready this evening, and your banking access will be fully operational by tomorrow morning. And my old identity? Walter Harrison will officially die of complications from his medical emergency sometime tonight. Natural causes, witnessed by medical professionals, completely legitimate. The safe house in Vancouver was a modest apartment overlooking English Bay, furnished simply but comfortably. Rodriguez's team had prepared everything I'd need for my transition. New clothes in my size, basic toiletries, and most importantly, a complete set of identity documents for my new life. Meet Thomas Sterling, Rodriguez said, handing me a Canadian passport, driver's license, and banking cards. 70-year-old retired engineer, widowed, no children, clean credit history, and full legal status as a Canadian resident. The banking relationships are established. 3 accounts in different institutions, all accessible with the cards and PINs I am providing. Your funds have already been transferred and are immediately available. How much? 7 million. After fees and transfer costs. More than enough to live comfortably anywhere in the world for the rest of your natural life. That evening, as I sat on the apartment balcony watching the sunset over English Bay, I received a phone call that made everything feel complete. A detective informed me that Walter Harrison had died of complications from his condition, and there would be a memorial service next week. I think I'll skip the service, I said. I prefer to remember Walter as he was in his better days. Over the next several days, I monitored news reports about Walter Harrison's death and Robert and Lisa's public response. They published an obituary describing a successful businessman who'd been lovingly cared for by his devoted children during his final years of declining health. But the most interesting development came 2 weeks after the memorial service. Robert and Lisa were discovering the true scope of their inheritance. After expenses, they were left with approximately $30 million in accessible assets, far less than the $180 million they'd been expecting. 3 months after Walter Harrison's death, I began the final phase of my plan. Using the investigative resources available to Thomas Sterling, I started documenting Robert and Lisa's financial activities since inheriting their father's estate. What I discovered was exactly what I'd expected. They were living far beyond their means, spending money at an unsustainable rate, and making financial decisions based on the assumption that they had access to $180 million rather than the $30 million they'd actually inherited. Robert had bought a $3 million house, a luxury car collection worth $800,000, and a yacht he couldn't afford to maintain. Lisa had purchased a designer wardrobe, expensive jewelry, and was funding elaborate vacations that consumed tens of thousands of dollars per month. Both of them had quit their jobs, assuming they were now wealthy enough to live off investment income that was actually insufficient to support their new lifestyle. At their current rate of spending, they'd be broke within 3 years. But they'd be more than broke. They'd be in serious financial trouble, because many of their purchases had been financed based on their expected inheritance. When the money ran out, they'd face foreclosures, repossessions, and bankruptcy proceedings that would destroy their credit and eliminate any possibility of maintaining their current standard of living. 1 year after Walter Harrison's death, I decided it was time for Thomas Sterling to write a letter. Not to Robert and Lisa directly, that would have been too simple, too merciful for people who'd planned to steal my life and lock me away forever. Instead, I wrote to Sarah Chern, an investigative reporter for the Seattle Times who specialized in stories about financial fraud and family crimes. She'd built her reputation on exposing scams that targeted vulnerable elderly people, and she had a particular interest in cases where family members were the perpetrators. Miss Chern, I wrote, I have information about a story you covered last year, the death of businessman Walter Harrison and his family's advocacy for elder care reform. What I am about to tell you will fundamentally change your understanding of that case and provide you with the biggest story of your career. I enclosed copies of bank records showing the $90 million transfer that had occurred just before Walter Harrison's commitment to Sunset Manor. I included documentation of Robert and Lisa's fraudulent activities, the forged medical records, the fake power of attorney documents, the systematic theft from Walter's accounts over more than a year. Most importantly, I included proof that Walter Harrison had not actually died at the medical facility, but had staged his death and assumed a new identity to escape from children who'd imprisoned him, and was systematically stealing his life's work. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning and received a phone call from Sarah Chern on Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Sterling, this is Sarah Chern from the Seattle Times. I received your letter about Walter Harrison, and I have to ask, are you claiming to be Walter Harrison? I'm claiming that Walter Harrison never died, that his children committed multiple felonies in their attempt to steal his fortune, and that the man everyone thinks is dead has been watching their behavior for the past year while planning the perfect revenge. Can you prove what you're saying? Miss Chern, I can prove that Walter Harrison transferred $90 million out of his accounts on the same day his children had him committed to a care facility based on fraudulent medical evaluations. I can prove that he escaped from that facility using a staged medical emergency. I can prove that his death certificate was falsified and that he's been living under a new identity ever since. And you can prove all this because I am Walter Harrison. Thomas Sterling is the identity I created to escape from my children's conspiracy and protect the fortune they were systematically stealing from me. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Seattle. Sarah Chern was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp, focused energy that suggested she was very good at her job. Over the next 4 hours, I told Sarah the complete story of my children's conspiracy, my escape from Sunset Manor, and the year I'd spent watching them squander their inheritance while believing their father was dead. I showed her bank records, medical documents, legal paperwork, and communications that proved every detail of what Robert and Lisa had done to me. Most importantly, I showed her recent financial records proving that Robert and Lisa were spending money at an unsustainable rate and would be bankrupt within 2 years despite inheriting $30 million. This is incredible, Sarah said when I'd finished. If I can verify even half of what you've told me, this will be the biggest elder abuse story in decades. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chern called to tell me that her investigation was complete and the story would be published in Sunday's edition of the Seattle Times. Walter, she said, This story is going to destroy your children. Are you prepared for that? My children destroyed themselves when they chose to betray the man who raised them and loved them. I am just making sure they face consequences for their choices. That Sunday morning, I bought a copy of the Seattle Times and sat in my Vancouver apartment reading about Walter Harrison's return from the dead. The headline dominated the entire front page. Back from the dead, local businessman exposes children's elder abuse scheme. Below it was a photo of me as Thomas Sterling, sitting comfortably in my Vancouver apartment, clearly alive and well-dressed, holding up a copy of Walter Harrison's death certificate with a sardonic smile. By noon, my phone was ringing with calls from journalists, television producers, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to interview the man who'd faked his own death to escape from his children's elder abuse scheme. But the call I was really waiting for came at PM. Dad? Lisa's voice was barely a whisper, shaking with shock and disbelief. Hello, Lisa. You're alive. You're actually alive. I'm very much alive, healthy, wealthy, and living exactly the life I choose to live. But we saw you die. We were at your memorial service. We grieved for you. You grieved for your inheritance. You mourned the money you thought you'd lost when I died with $90 million unaccounted for. Dad, we can explain everything. We were trying to help you. Lisa, I have recordings of your conversations about drugging me to create symptoms of mental confusion. I have copies of the forged medical records you created to justify having me declared incompetent. I have bank records showing every dollar you stole from my accounts over 18 months of systematic theft. We weren't stealing. We were managing your affairs because you were getting confused. I was never confused, Lisa. I was investigating your conspiracy against me while pretending not to understand what you were doing. The money you moved, where is it? We need to know where that money went. There it was. Not concern about my well-being. Not relief that I was alive. Not remorse about what they'd done to me. Just concern about money they thought they were entitled to. The money is exactly where I put it. In accounts you'll never access. Controlled by an identity you'll never trace. Dad, please. We're your children. We made mistakes, but we're still family. Lisa, you stopped being my family when you decided to have me imprisoned, so you could steal my life's work. Robert stopped being my son when he forged documents to access my bank accounts. What do you want from us? I don't want anything from you, Lisa. I already have everything I need: my freedom, my money, and my dignity. What I want is for you to face consequences for what you did to me. What kind of consequences? Criminal charges, federal prison time, asset forfeiture, public humiliation, the same things that happen to anyone who commits elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. I hung up and turned off my phone. They'd had a year to show remorse for what they'd done, to express concern about their father's welfare, to demonstrate that they understood the magnitude of their betrayal. Instead, they'd spent that year living in luxury funded by money they'd stolen, giving interviews about their devotion to their father's memory, and treating his death as an opportunity for publicity and sympathy. The FBI arrests came exactly 3 weeks after Sarachan's story was published. Robert was arrested at his house at M, handcuffed on his front porch while his neighbors watched through their windows. Lisa was arrested at her daughter's school during morning drop-off, cuffed in the parking lot while parents and teachers stared in shock. Both of them were denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. Their houses were searched and their assets were frozen pending investigation. Every luxury item they purchased with money stolen from me was seized as evidence and potential restitution. The trial began 6 months later and lasted 8 weeks. I testified for 3 full days, telling the jury exactly what my children had done to me and how I'd been forced to fake my own death to protect myself from their conspiracy. But the most damaging testimony came from Robert and Lisa themselves. When asked why he'd forged medical records to gain access to my bank accounts, Robert said he'd been protecting the family's financial interests and ensuring that my assets were properly managed during my declining years. Even facing 20 years in prison, they couldn't bring themselves to admit that they'd been motivated by greed rather than love, that they'd seen me as an obstacle to their financial goals rather than a father who deserved their respect and care. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Robert was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Lisa was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Both were ordered to pay full restitution of $2.3 million plus damages of $5 million for the trauma and suffering they'd caused. Since they'd already spent most of their inheritance on luxury goods that had been seized as evidence, they had no realistic way to pay these obligations. They would emerge from prison as middle-aged ex-convicts with massive debts, no assets, no professional prospects, and no family relationships. Today, 3 years after Walter Harrison's supposed death and 2 years after his miraculous resurrection, I'm living exactly the life I choose to live. Thomas Sterling has a comfortable apartment in Vancouver overlooking English Bay, with views of mountains and water that remind me daily of how beautiful the world can be when you're free to enjoy it on your own terms. Walter Harrison's fortune is safe in offshore accounts that generate more income than Thomas Sterling could spend in several lifetimes. Every month, I receive financial statements showing that my wealth continues to grow despite my comfortable lifestyle and generous charitable donations. But more than the money, I have something that no amount of wealth can buy: complete freedom from the fear, stress, and betrayal that defined the last years of Walter Harrison's life. Robert and Lisa Harrison are currently serving their federal prison sentences at separate facilities, where they'll remain for the next 10 years. When they're released, they'll be in their 50s, with no assets, no professional prospects, and criminal records that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Instead of inheriting $180 million as loving children, they received $30 million as thieves, spent most of it on luxury goods, and will spend the rest of their lives paying penalties for their greed. I occasionally receive letters from other elderly people who read about my case and are dealing with similar situations. I always respond with the same advice: document everything, trust no one completely, and remember that your age doesn't diminish your intelligence or your right to control your own life. My case has been featured in documentaries about elder abuse, discussed in academic papers about family financial crimes, and used by advocacy groups to push for stronger legal protections for vulnerable elderly Americans. But for me, the real victory isn't the public recognition or the policy changes my case might have inspired. The real victory is that I refused to be destroyed by people who thought they loved money more than they loved me. And I found a way to build a life so good that their betrayal became irrelevant to my happiness. My name was Walter Harrison, and my family said I was losing my mind. They locked me in a care home, stole my accounts, and thought they'd taken everything. But they forgot one crucial detail: I still had the password. Now I sit in my comfortable apartment overlooking English Bay, sipping my tea, debt-free and completely free, while they serve their prison sentences and contemplate the biggest mistake of their lives. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. Sometimes the best revenge is getting even, systematically, completely, and permanently. And sometimes the best revenge is living so well that your enemy's betrayal becomes irrelevant to your happiness. The password they forgot I had wasn't just to my bank accounts. It was the password to my freedom, my dignity, and my right to live exactly the life I choose to live. And that's a password they'll never crack. Thank you for joining us for this Justice Tales masterpiece. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who believes that age is just a number, that victims don't have to stay victims, and that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one everyone thinks is helpless. Until next time, this is Justice Tales, where every victim has the power to become the victor, and every betrayal contains the seeds of perfect justice.